Evening, everybody. My name is Luke Hickey. I'm the Assistant Director General of the Engagement Branch here at the National Library. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening for our talk. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodians of the land on which we're meeting tonight, the Ngunnawal people. I'd like to acknowledge their ongoing connection to this land and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and through them to all First Nations people here tonight or listening online. As a meeting place, Canberra has been the cradle of numerous stories and a country of creativity. The Ngunnawal people and indeed First Nations people all across Australia have been keepers and sharers of stories and histories for millennia. And this is a legacy that the library is proud to continue to follow here today. Tonight we're really pleased to host one of Australia's leading historians, Mark McKenna, as he discusses his new work, The Shortest History of Australia. Mark is the author of several prize-winning books, including From the Edge, Australia's Lost Histories, Return to Uluru, and An Eye for Eternity, The Life of Manning Clark, which won the Prime Minister's Literary Award for non-fiction, and the Victorian, New South Wales, Queensland and South Australian Premiers Awards as well. He's joined tonight by fellow historian Frank Bongiorno, author of 3 acclaimed histories himself, Dreamers and Schemers, A Political History of Australia, the 80s, the decade that transformed Australia, and the sex lives of Australians. Diverse range of topics there, Frank. Frank is a Professor of History at the ANU here in Canberra and the President of the Council for the Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences. Together, they will discuss Mark's compelling new version of our national story, which provides a greater sense of what Australian history is and encourages us to explore the truths, the half-truths and the other surprises of previous literature. Frank will open the mic for audience questions towards the end of the evening, so you'll have an opportunity to add to the discussion yourselves as well. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mark and Frank.
Well, great. Thanks so much, Luke. And I'd like to associate myself with your acknowledgements of the traditional owners. Mark.
Frank.
Congratulations on Shortest History of Australia.
Thank you.
I'd venture to say that when you set out on this journey to research and write this book, you probably didn't imagine that you'd be competing in the bookshops with Tony Abbott, also the author of a 1-volume History of Australia,
yes.
or Schist, as Keith Sinclair used to call it. Keith Sinclair, very famous New Zealand historian. A short history, a schist, he called it, rather mischievously. I did notice, though, Mark, there is a preemptive strike at Tony Abbott on page 238, being a historian, of course.
Starting to get concerned now, Frank.
On Australia Day in 2015, Abbott stunned his colleagues and the nation by knighting Prince Philip, an old man already forced to walk under the life-threatening weight of a wardrobe full of medals. So thank you, Mark. But I did want to... Yes.
Yes.
I did want to ask you, though, I mean, I wouldn't describe this as entering a crowded field, but it is a field where there's a lot of kind of public history making going on. And,
sure.
You know, quite apart from Tony Abbott's book, there's a documentary, Sky documentary that goes with it. There's also Julianne Schultz's The Idea of Australia, which is SBS multi-part documentary as well. So I wanted to ask you about where you see the shortest history sitting
good question.
in that landscape.
It's a really interesting time to publish a short history of Australia for all of those reasons that Frank just went through. You know, Tony Abbott's book is there some weeks before mine. And, you know, I guess I'd like to say that it's not a surprise to me that Tony Abbott would write a history of Australia. He's written, of course, he's a published author. He's written books before. He's had a long-standing interest in Australian history. So, you know, in that sense, it's not a surprise. The timing, of course, it was my fate to to be in conversation. And we shall see how that progresses over the coming months and so on. But the sense I get about that particular book, just before we get to mine, is that, you know, from what I've read of the way it's packaged, is that it seems to be in many ways, to my mind, a kind of rescue mission in the sense that, oh, the historians, they wouldn't write a book like this. I'll write it. And I'll sort of, all of those historians who've presented that kind of black armband negative view of Australian history, I'm now going to present a more heroic and positive and proud version of the Australian story, right? And I guess, you know, that's understandable in a way, given who Tony Abbott is, former Prime Minister and Conservative politician. But if your starting point for a short history is the nation state, okay, if you think that your job as a historian is to write the history of the formation of the nation state, as I think, you know, it's broadly conceived in that book, then I think, you know, or I felt writing this book, that you kind of you can get trapped into walking through the same familiar landmarks. And, you know, conscious of all of the other histories of Australia, as, you know, you alluded to, that have been written in previous sort of decade and a half, 2 decades, I really felt that we didn't need another one of those, you know? So I thought I really felt I had to come up with something different. And we can get to that. But to the point of your question about the context now, I mean, I think it's really interesting to be... We're witnessing the interest in Australian history is alive and well, you know. And we can see that from the television documentaries. We can see that from so many ways in which history is discussed in the public domain. But we're also living in a moment where we know that history within schools, for example, a number of history teachers, like all teachers, is struggling to keep their foothold. History within the academy and the universities, the number of full-time historians in university departments has dropped a third over the last 40 or 50 years. The number of student enrolments, you know, we're subject to the Morrison government's recent legislation, which increased the prices of degrees in the humanities and history especially. So, you know, in some ways history is under threat in those traditional formats, and in another way, the interest in it in the public sense is very much alive. So I guess that's where I'm kind of pitching this book, you know, into that public interest in Australian history, but also trying to ask, well, how can we reconfigure this in a way that doesn't walk necessarily through those familiar landmarks and tries to do it differently, I guess.
Great.
You know.
And I'd like to talk more about the very innovative structure that you chose, Mark, in a moment. But, you know, you're claim biographer, as Luke just mentioned, of Manning Clark. One of the first things I noticed when I walked down the stairs is that, you know, you weren't wearing an Akubra hat.
I've got one at home.
Or a fob watch, a chain or anything.
No.
Boots. And we were offered the option of a grand entrance, and the two of us decided, no, let's just creep in behind Luke when he's up here. Whereas we know what Manning would have done. Sure. There would have been a grand entrance, surely. So I wanted to ask you about the kind of image, self-image, but perhaps public image of the historian. Yeah. The public life of history, as our colleague Dipesh Chakrabarty's called it. Yeah. The authority that history or history exercises in the public sphere, historians exercise in the public sphere. Very different, I think, from the world of Manning. Oh,
extremely. I mean, the point, you know, that image of Manning Clark in that three-piece suit with the large Akubra hat and the goatee beard and this kind of very, very serious delivery. And the authority that he carried, I mean, you know, the position he occupied in Australian culture, it's phenomenal to just compare that now to Manning's position, if you like, to... Now, I mean, I think a figure like that today would be kind of laughed out of court, right? And that's, of course, because, in a sense, he's a creature of his time. The bicentenary was, of course, the big moment there for Manning. That was where he was at the peak of his of his fame. And, you know, I guess in many ways we've seen the decline of the authority of that professional historian in some ways, right? And I think that, you know, that's good and bad. I mean, I think that it's great that we have more voices now. We don't want guru-like figures who, I mean, at one point I think, often bring this example up. About a year before Manning died, he was going to become an envoy for Australia to solve the coming Iraq War. So that seems incredible now. So it's a good thing that we have far more diverse range of people talking about history. We're not as prone to the guru-type one-voice effect. On the other hand, I think that history as a discipline is evidence-based. That's kind of stating the obvious, but I think that, like the sciences, like in a post-truth domain, that a lot of evidence-based disciplines are struggling for traction in the public culture increasingly, because we're living at a time where many people are willing to believe or turn away from evidence-based and be deeply suspicious about those things. So for me as a historian, I think that's one of the challenges still, right? Yeah, at the moment, is to, okay, how can we write in a way that is going to, play into that environment where a lot of people think sceptically, or even think that, well, it's just one version of history against another version, Do
you think that's been a part of the problem, that we've all, as professional historians, most of us, I think, have embraced this idea that, there isn't a single, narrative, that history is diverse, it's pluralistic. Most of us wouldn't say that, one interpretation is as good as any other, but there has been a broadly, I think, more relativistic understanding of history in the last couple of generations. I mean, has that been a part of the issue here, as distinct from the prophetic, not pathetic, the prophetic sort version of Manning Clark type?
I mean, I don't see it as a problem. I see that as a really positive development. I mean, for me personally, right, as a historian, if I ask myself, well, where is the point of electricity? Where is the point of the most exciting possibilities in Australian history now? It's trying to grapple with the extraordinary revolution that's taken place since, late 60s, 70s, right? And the way in which Indigenous histories, cultures, knowledge has slowly, come to occupy a much more dominant part of our public culture. So, but trying to grapple with that and understand it and bring it into a short history, for example, right? That's an exciting point of interest and challenge. And to do it in a way which to me is really important, which is not ornamental, right? Not to sort of, start with a chapter on Indigenous Australia and then sort of you've got 220 plus years of European settlement and so on. So how do you carry it through? How do you kind of bring that Indigenous presence and history all the way through? And really, I guess in some ways, it's probably the centre, it's the central point of the book. Yeah.
I mean, you get to Mungo Man, Lady Mungo, right at the very end of the book, which is, I think, striking in that sense. Now, this is a bit hackneyed, I suppose, comparing Australia to the US sometimes, but I'm going to ask you to do it anyway.
Please,
you've just come back from the United States. I wanted to ask you, do we worry... I mean, I'm sort of reminded of, in the 19th century, they'd say, what will they think in England? And I'm wondering if, we worry too much about the United States. And I'm also interested in sort of... I mean, you're in Washington, how Australian identity is projected.
Thanks. That's a really good question. Let's start with America now, and, always looking to England in the past and now, I think definitely you can look at the recent kerfuffle over whether Albanese would manage to get a phone call with Trump, and how our national media was transfixed by this question for months, which is why he wore the Joy Division T-shirt, I guess, when he came down the plane. But it's astonishing now. I think if you even compare Australia's world news to maybe even a decade ago or 15 years ago, US media, US politics dominates Australia's media in a way I think that it has never done before. Now, of course, there's good reasons for that, and that is the man who's president, and because of his ability to constantly flood that zone with all sorts of attractive bait, basically.
That's not usually the phrase used about flooding.
No.
I believe we're being recorded by the ABC, so I suppose we've got to be a bit careful.
Flooding the zone with shit, Frank. Yes, that's right. So
your Catholic school must have been less strict than mine, Mark. I think if they let you say
it was. No, we were less strict, I think. But so there is a sense that there is this, where's British news? Where's other world news? Where the US world politics just dominates to that extent, and also our talk about our foreign policy. I mean, it's interesting to me that Anthony Albanese went to Indonesia. His first foreign visit after winning the election was to Indonesia, which was, of course, a statement about the importance of that relationship. But that's now been lost. It's been swamped by all of this discussion about AUKUS and about, meeting with Trump and whether there'll be a slapdown in the Oval Office or it'll be embarrassing, etc. And I do get the sense that we're still very, very deeply anxious about whether we'll be okay with the Americans. I really get that sense from the media coverage. As to your question about my time there, I mean, basically our daughter is working in Washington for 2 to 3 years, and so we went there to visit her, and I'd never been before. Lived 7 years of my life in Europe, but had never been to the US. And so, the first thing you notice is if your point of contact for any society is reading the media, then you arrive and you think, oh, okay, life is going on, people are living, they're going through the daily things, and you didn't have the sense that things were about to implode. In a way, it seems a tragedy to me that a society like the US, which is so rich, so much vitality, so much diversity, is tearing itself apart, is at war with itself. So on the point of Australia in Washington, I went to look at Australia's embassy, which was opened by Anthony Albanese in 2023. And I walked in there, grand building. It's Australia's second largest embassy, I think, after Indonesia. Very impressive building. You walk in, go through security. There's an Aboriginal flag, an Australian flag, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flag. In the corner, there's some Yolngu burial poles, several of them from Arnhem Land. On the wall is a framed, really beautifully written version of Kevin Rudd's apology to Indigenous Australians in 2008. Around the corner, there's Aboriginal art on the walls. And, it's so striking. How do we project ourselves to the outside world? And the extent to which we rely on Indigenous symbols, Indigenous art, Indigenous culture, to say, this is who we are, this is what's unique about us. Yet somehow, I think we don't really quite understand how much we lean on that to project ourselves overseas, and what a disconnect at times there can be between that external symbolism and our readiness to really sort of embrace it fully in our national, the way we think about ourselves as a nation.
And your book, in a lot of ways, is is calibrated with that sort of dilemma, isn't it? Because I mean, you do write about the nation, but you want to write beyond the nation. You want to write about country. And what's happening in that, I suppose, is a kind of perhaps a conflation in some ways of nation and country, or is it an appropriation? But it's clearly the projection of a very long history, a history going back tens of millennia.
That's right.
For the sake of a modern Australian identity in obviously a nation-state setting, an embassy.
And it's not necessarily new either. You can remember that the history of royal tours in Australia also shows that when Australian politicians were sort of struggling, the royals are coming, what are we going to do? What are we going to perform? They always relied on Indigenous Australians to do traditional dance for the Queen and Prince Philip and so on. I one of the things I'm trying to do in the book, I guess, is to say, well, our sense of our history we have to see ourselves as a continent, I'm trying to think of the land itself, in a way, as an active force that has shaped us and who we are, as much as any other political forces, and to really make that a character in the book and to give it a sense of agency. I mean, and I do that in various ways, and we can talk about that. But it's another part of the book I'm trying to. Yeah.
And one of the early chapters has a title, The Island Dilemma. Could you tell us what you mean by
The Island Dilemma?
Island Dilemma.
Good question.
Yeah.
In a way, it goes to some of the stuff we've just been talking about with the US. So, I mean, Australia's Island Dilemma it'll be familiar to everyone here, of course, because it's about our geography, it's about our geographical position, which is a long-standing issue, of course, in our history. So, even from the moment that Matthew Flinders maps, Louis Freycinet's maps of Australia as a freestanding continent in the early 19th century, the moment we can see our continent standing alone in relation to the rest of the world, it's mapped there, you get this very early on, you get these contradictory kind of messages. In other words, this isolation is an advantage. Who would want to come all the way down here to bother us? You'll still hear this trotted out from time to time. And of course, there's the other narrative, which is, oh my God, we're vulnerable. We could be invaded by, usually in the 19th century it was China, Japan, and even 3 days ago, Richard Marles said that China was both Australia's largest trading partner, a source of great opportunity, and Australia's, quote, most important significant security anxiety. So again, you come back to this opportunity versus threat, and point of anxiety. So that's a tension in our politics and history that is simply with us. We live with it, and it has deep historical roots. And I really wanted to, I guess I wanted to start the book in a way where people would sit up and think, "What is this a history of Australia? What's going on here?" And so I wanted to sort of present those larger ideas right up front. So there's the chapter on the island dilemma, and the history of that, which also ends with Christmas Island, and it's, of course, that's connected to the history of refugees, etc. But, the first chapter opens with the Opera House and then moves backwards, if you like, to the Indigenous history of that particular site. The second chapter goes to Ubia in Arnhem Land. I don't know how many of you have been to Ubia. Think after Uluru, it's the most popular tourist site in northern Australia. It's an extraordinary place because you step up, firstly for the rock art, that goes back tens of thousands of years to the time when Australia and New Guinea were one, for example. Incredible rock art galleries, not only at Ubia, but within the vicinity. And you stand and look across this incredible floodplain. And, when I was standing there looking and thinking, well, New Guinea, Timor, Indonesia, they're closer than Sydney and Melbourne and Adelaide. And you think of, this is the north of Australia where, of course, the ancestors of Indigenous Australians first entered the country. This is the point where, or the region I should say, where archaeologists in 2017 discovered evidence of 65,000 years of Indigenous habitation on this continent, right? And when you reflect on all of this, and the environmental dimensions of this place, you quickly realise, okay, so Australian history does not begin in the southeast corner of the continent. I mean, this may sound obvious to some, but that's the way we've thought about it for so long, that it begins in the southeast corner and we have the predictable cast of characters who get wheeled out. But in fact, it begins in the north for all sorts of reasons. And that's where we're tied in more closely to our region, right? And in a way, when I hear some of the conversations about AUKUS, it does seem to me that we are kind of leapfrogging over this region that we're actually in, and that we are still deeply connected, wanting to hang on to those traditional historical allies that go right back to our the British invasion, obviously Britain and the USA.
So you challenge us on geography and space, but also probably more radically here on time. I think the most sustained treatment of convict Australia in the book occurs probably 4/5 of the way in.
That's right.
After page 200.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Really quite startling. And
That's
I
right.
want to ask you about why. I mean, you've already given us some hints, but why you adopted that thematic structure for the book, the thinking behind that.
Yeah,
now, there is
okay.
a critique that's well developed now, I guess, among post-colonial historians. I'm thinking here of Time's Monster by Priya Safi, which basically says, well, history as a discipline, has adopted this kind of idea of a relentless forward movement of time, creating progress.
That's right.
Which of course is counterposed to, primitivism, savagery, all those sorts of concepts, and so it becomes, it legitimises colonial violence, imperialism.
And that's the danger,
and so on.
of that kind of history, where you go from pre-British Australia and then you just walk through to now, So. And I was, we're thinking here, you're alluding in a way to Indigenous understandings of history where, they're certainly not linear, where things are kind of all eternally present in the one moment, so to speak. So I really wanted to throw caution to the wind in a traditional sense. And that's one reason why that, we don't get significant discussion until 4/5 of the way through. I mean, as to, the way that I tried to tackle the structure, I think for everyone here who hasn't seen the book, it's important to say, well, one of the ways, or two of the ways I did that was firstly by delving into. I guess I wanted a book that was not compressed. The problem with the genre of the short history is that you can easily end up writing a kind of summary or a kind of recapitulation of things that people kind of already know, and you place a different emphasis here and there, right? So I wanted to avoid that. And so one of the ways I tried to avoid it was to try and be expansive, to try and give myself room to go into detail about things. And I did that by diving into different places around the continent and overseas before each chapter, right? And I did that also, for partly selfish reasons, and that is, as an author of a book like this, I think that I said to myself, right, if I'm not learning, if I'm not discovering something when I'm researching and writing this book, then there's no point. I don't just want to be summarising what I already know. So by going to all of these different places, I had to do, original primary research, and I learnt, all sorts of things opened up about how I could connect those places to the broader story. And it also allowed me to play around with time, so I can move back and forwards, more in some chapters, I suppose, than others. But yeah, that was part of the thinking.
I wanted to ask you about, you've written wonderfully in many different books on place. You've got a line early in the book that basically says, yet in its entirety, Australian history is inherently place-bound, which I think goes beyond some of the things you've written in the past. And I wondered what you meant by that.
No, thanks for that question. In fact, you know how it goes with books. You write sentences like that, and then after you've written them and the book's out and it's a concrete thing, you think, I could have added this. So I would add these two things probably to answer that question. Why do I say Indigenous history or Australian history is place-bound more than many other places? Well, I guess let's start with two images, right? You probably all have seen the map of Indigenous Australia that AATSIS has produced some time ago now, where Australia is a mosaic, right? It's a mosaic of First Nations, hundreds, right, in different colours. And then think of the other map that you know, Australia as 6 states, 2 territories, right? And you just think of the radical difference between those two images. And you realise that all the incredible diversity of all of the ways that those different nations have connected and related to and to their own specific countries. The different climatic zones, extraordinary diversity, right? And added to that, when we have welcome to country or acknowledgement of country now, and I know all of the debate around that, but one of the things we do when we do that, I think, is, when we sit there and we hear someone say, well, welcome to this country or that country, is that we are actually acknowledging the importance of these different nations, these different countries to... It's a mosaic that we're coming to terms with now. We're in the middle of it. That's exciting, that's interesting, that's different, and it's unique to here. So that connection to country, to place, is something that is... it's not exclusively Australian, of course, but it's got particular inflections here that again make history really exciting and thinking about it in different ways. And that to me means that you can think. We often, use the word inclusive. How can we be more inclusive? Well, one of the ways to start is by always keeping in mind those two maps, and thinking about what those welcome to countries always mean, and then, linking that through to saying, well, yeah, country, place, we've got so many histories here. And not only in the Indigenous sense, but also in the settler sense as well. If you're looking from the Pilbara, or you're looking from, and Henry Reynolds' book, Reese, new book, looking from the north, it depends where you're looking from, right? And where you're looking from, there's different points of connection to the so-called national story. And that's like exploring all those different points of perspectives. Writing about different places shifts the perspective. You get different perspectives, different angles of vision, I guess.
And yet, you still conscientiously, as the well-trained historian that you are, you grapple with the older narratives as well. So you deal with the Protestant-Catholic divide. You deal with class conflict. Relations between men and women. Those narratives that are now a reasonably familiar part of our history. I mean, how do you balance that sort of more challenging approach, if you like, the history of country approach that you were just talking about, history of place approach, with, I guess, what are more traditionally social, political, cultural narratives, and probably more embedded in the settler experience, more than the well, not just the settler experience, of course, but I guess they've been more identified with what we understand as a conventional kind of European history of Australia.
Yeah, good question. No. I mean, look, in the book, for example, there's a chapter that deals pretty much primarily with the history of sectarianism in Australia, right? But the way it starts, and this is true to how it happened for me, right? One of the most magical places in Sydney for me has always been Waverley Cemetery. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. Maybe a lot of people on the southeast corner who've ever been to Sydney would have gone occasionally, or at least walked past it. It sits between Bronte Beach and Clovelly Beach, on just near Sydney. And I mean, this incredible cemetery that tumbles down to the Tasman Sea, and it's one of the most dramatic spots in Australia, I think. And Manning Clark, of course, I mean, when I think about it now, the frontispiece of my biography of Clark has a photograph of Manning standing in Waverley Cemetery. I just thought of that and realised so there's a connection there, I guess. But so I would often wander, when I was working in Sydney at Sydney University, I'd often go there, wander around. And one of the things, that I got interested in was those different sections, the way we segment religious beliefs in death as well. We've got the Anglican section, we've got the Catholic section, and so on and so on. And, there's a memorial at Waverley for example, to the United Irish Rebels of 1798 that was erected 100 years later to great fanfare. At certain points, that was I thought, okay, I can connect the history of this place, right, to the history of sectarianism because it's writ large there, you know, and looking at who was buried there. And of course, it's still connected to everything's connected to the Indigenous thing because you think of all of the strong Indigenous presence that's there on that coastline, you know, and you think of Lawson, you know, the great Henry Lawson, who's buried there, and there are still pilgrimages. You'll find people. Sometimes watch people being led on tours to Lawson's grave. But Lawson's grave, you know, in the introduction, I kind of looking at that, and then of course his wife, Bertha, is buried next to him when she died in the 50s. But you know, his wife, of course, filed a affidavit for cruelty and was divorced because of his domestic violence. And you read the letter that she wrote, the affidavit, and it's, you know, it's like gut-wrenching sort of, you know, he hit me with a bottle, he bashed me, blackened my eye, etc., etc. And it's another reminder, you know, that so many of Australia's, you know, traditional myths and so on are deeply connected, of course, to the history of violence against women. And this is one of the things I guess, you know, we could talk about it, but I wanted to grapple with in the book. So often when we hear public discussion of history, the whole thing of balance, you know,
the balance sheet.
The balance sheet. You know, it's as if we're in a grocery store. I'll take a packet of this and I'll put it on the scales. I need to balance it with another packet of this, and so on and so on. It's a pretty crude idea, right? So, I mean, the truth, of course, is, and this is one of the things that is strong, I wanted to get across, you know, and it's no news to you, of course, but I mean, it's that we have to hold all these things in tension at once in our imagination. It's not as if you go, oh, we'll have a cheery history of democracy here, and we'll use that to balance out some of that dark stuff about dispossession.
Blemishes.
Blemishes,
Blemishes
right?
was the phrase that I think John Howard used, wasn't it?
Yeah, blemish.
Yeah, blemish.
Right.
Yeah.
The word itself, of course, suggests, you know. So instead of thinking of it like that, to see that these things, of course, are all deeply interconnected. You know, the history of democracy, the fair go, equality, these things were racially defined, as we know. So the history of racism is connected to the history of democracy. The history of dispossession is connected to the history of democracy. It's all entangled.
And moving away from your more traditional chronology where, you know, gold rush, self-government, federation, World War One, reminds us that, you know, you're still getting massacres on the frontiers of Northern Australia at the time Australia's federating, at the time the Labor Party's being formed, at the time, really, that the Australians are going off to Gallipoli. It challenges that sense of, again, a kind of a series of discrete topics and that, again, relentless forward march towards some sort of fuller nationhood, I guess.
No, that's really well put. I mean, I've got a chapter on Anzac Cove. The book starts with Anzac Cove, and at the end of that chapter, it finishes with a section on the frontier at the same time in Northern Australia, Northwestern Australia. You know, just consider this statistic, you know, between 1901, when Australia federated, and 1918, the end of the First World War, at least just over 500 Indigenous people were massacred in the Northern Territory and Western Australia alone. Right? At the same time. So the newspapers that are reporting on the battles from the Western Front and Anzac are also publishing stories of this violence. So this sacrosanct history of Gallipoli that we so often imagine and talk about as being completely separate to this history of the frontier, no, these things are happening contemporaneously. So I wanted to bring that out, you know. And it really is extraordinary when you go to Anzac Cove, you know, there's this narrow beach, this strip of shingle, and there's this obvious contrast between this small. It's got a tiny physical kind of presence, and yet we've got this enormous mythical thing that we've created around it. And you compare the history or our knowledge, right, of... I mean, we've got histories of, you know, the last shoe to be dropped or on Anzac Cove Beach, or the last this or the last that.
A rather unkind British political historian a few years ago said that the Australians are going to put up a memorial to anywhere that an Anzac had a piss during the First World War, which I thought was a bit unkind.
I think you went to the same school as me.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's Marist and Christian.
That's right, it's Marist and
Christian Brothers and Marist Brothers. There you go. They allowed us to say piss, but not
they did, and to drink furiously. That's right. Yeah. No, but I mean, it is quite something to just contemplate how we have so much history about that one event, right, and about the war generally, right, and compare that to our knowledge of the frontier wars, for example. It's like, and compare our knowledge of the history of Federation to the history of Anzac. And you'll see quite quickly, of course, why the history of Anzac has so much purchase, because it obviously taps into those traditional ideas about a nation being created from blood sacrifice rather than popular vote to a constitution, etc. So, and then there's the other question, which, you know, I've tried to grapple with for years, which is, how did we end up being a nation that's created its, you know, founding national myth of nationhood, 16,000 kilometres away, offshore, and why? And I really think it's deeply connected to the fact that we see those deaths of the Anzacs as honourable, and we can latch onto that in a way that we still can't come to terms with the importance of the other deaths that happened on our own soil. And what we've done with that Anzac myth and legend is, you know, we're so selective about it, and we're so allergic to criticism. You know, at the moment, Chris Masters' book, you know, about Ben Robert Smith is being withdrawn from a prize at the War Memorial. He's not able to give a lecture at Tuggeranong. Yasmin Abdul Majid in 2017, who was almost sort of hounded out of the country when she tweeted something that was using the words "lest we forget" in a different context. We're incredibly allergic to criticism about this. And I think that, you know, that goes to a really important, if I can just say, a thing about the book, and is that history's always contested, it's always going to be a point of debate, but when we look at the long view, you know, this is a country that thought initially, right, it had no history. We have to wait for history to come because the whole Indigenous... Right? And then we thought, oh my God, the convicts. That's embarrassing, right? We can't have convicts being our founding hero, you know, people, generation. No. For 150 plus years, we were terrified of that. And then from the 60s and 70s on, we've got the emergence of, you know, the revisionist history, and that's unsettled a lot of our traditional myths about who we are and how the nation was founded. So we've always been deeply anxious about our history and the story that we tell. When we talk about the history wars, it's not new. It's a different sort of, it's a variation on a well-worn theme.
You quote Manning Clark towards the end, actually, 1975. We were colonials, and they don't make their own history. For more than 100 years, we were in a position of children. We were dependent. We were backward. We were isolated. We were cringers. Yeah. There's that idea that your history's made by others. That deep anxiety that, you know.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because here's a person, Manning, who wrote 6 volumes, History of Australia, who basically devoted his entire life to trying to, you know, spread knowledge and interest about Australian history. When he spoke in public, actually 50 years ago almost to the day, he was in a few months earlier, he was in Bendigo. I was looking this up the other day, and he's talking to a group of students, and he says something like this. He says, we were cringers, you know, up until the 20th century. We were cringers. We didn't make our own history because we were colonials. Of course, that is just not true. Because we believed we were British, didn't mean that we didn't create and struggle for, of course, our own democracy. We did make our own history, even when we were colonials. So, I mean, that's that's something that's really important as well, is that for so long, we've explained the history of our democracy as a story of British largesse, It came from, it was granted. But of course that's not true, in a way. Your political history of Australia shows that, right? So Manning was still very preoccupied, and people of his generation, with the British thing, right? And because they felt that it was crippling Australia's capacity to be itself truly independent. And I think that idea has now shifted from Britain to the United States.
Now, Mark, I'm going to... So we're about to go to question time, so please get ready with a question if you'd like to ask one. I'm going to just, before we do that, though, ask Mark to read one passage, which I think in many ways sort of epitomises, captures your the place-based way in which you've written this book. So this is on the bushfires of late 2019-20. So
okay,
over to you, Mark. There it is.
Thanks. Okay. So I just preface this quickly by saying that, one of the things here, this is a chapter called Fire and Water. How do you bring the land and environmental history and, give it a strong presence in the history of Australia. And also to explore the psychological, emotional dimensions of what it means to live in a continent where we're all threatened at times by fire and flood, but especially fire. Okay, 31 December 2019, Mallacoota, Victoria. The photograph appeared in news outlets around the world. Enveloped by an eerie smoke-filled haze and the sinister glow of approaching fires, an 11-year-old boy steered a small boat carrying his mother, brother and family dog to safety. On shore, over 4,000 people were gathered on the beach, anxious to escape out-of-control bushfires driven by wild winds. The shoreline was littered with dead birds, charcoal and burnt leaves. People could hear gas bottles, cars and houses exploding in the near distance. If the radiant heat became unbearable, the authorities told them to stand in the water. There's only one road into Mallacoota, and it was now completely cut off by the fires. Rescue by air was too risky. Within days, the Royal Australian Navy was evacuating residents and tourists by sea to disaster relief centres in Melbourne. For once, the sensationalist headlines seemed accurate. Terror Coast, apocalypse now. The world saw this Australian beach town burn. NASA images showed gigantic plumes of smoke hovering over the southeast of the continent, then drifting slowly out into the Pacific. The photograph of the mast boy in the dinghy, his hand firmly grasping the tiller, captured the unthinkable. The beach, which for millions of Australians had long been a site of leisure and pleasure, was no longer safe. In the case of Australia's megafires, it was merely the last precarious strip of sand on which to stand. Thanks. Thanks, Frank. Thank you. Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Over to questions. So if anyone's got a question, I think there are roving microphones, so please go ahead. Don't be shy.
Great, thanks so much. My name is Alan Gamlin. I'm a professor at the ANU and my PhD is geography, but my first love was history. My first 2 degrees were in history, so I'm deeply jealous. In my heart of hearts, I would have been a historian. And I love the place-based approach to history that you've taken as well. Question is kind of a history nerdy question. What do you make of the argument of the global historians that any kind of national history is methodologically nationalistic? So it assumes that the nation state is kind of the natural, inevitable unit of social analysis, and so we tell a story a teleology that inevitably leads to the nation state. So some of the discussion sort of touched on that, the teleology of progress. But what do you make of that global history argument that you can't really, you can't be methodologically nationalistic about it?
Yeah, I kind of agree in many ways with it. I mean, this book is definitely not that as you just described it. It's the reverse, actually. But I think, that it's like everything. It's not that you can't write national history. I mean, national history, to write it, any nation's history has to be porous, yeah? It obviously is porous. I mean, so how can you show those connections, those broader connections? The mistake was to sort of, I guess, there was a period in Australian history where Australian history was predominantly written, from a exclusively national sort of frame, or even nationalist framework. And we're way beyond that now, that historians are doing incredible work in comparative history, transnational history. So I think that, in lots of ways that argument's been won, but it also depends how it's done, how you do it. Yeah, but to be conscious of that, definitely.
Other questions?
Hi, Mark.
Hi,
Ryan
Ryan.
here, former historian.
Pleased to see you.
Just to follow up the previous question, but I don't mean to age. You've been writing about Australian history for quite a while now. You were writing about Australian history when it was intensely political, or the last time it was. And I just wondered if you could offer any reflections on how that has changed and the politics of history, how that has evolved, and what it was like writing history now versus, say, in the late 90s and early 2000s.
Thanks, Ryan. That's a good question. Yeah. Look, I think that broadly Australian history is still a political, it's a live issue. It's a very, very hot issue politically still, right? I think the terms of the points of ignition are different to what they were, in the so-called history wars or even back earlier than that. We've come a long way. I mean, you mentioned this, Frank, in your review of Tony Abbott's book, where you point out that Tony Abbott draws on the work of historians like Lyndall Ryan, not Keith Winchottle, who was the sort of leader of the history wars in some ways, so that Abbott accepts a lot of the scholarship, right, that we were fighting over. In other words, there was a point where we were still arguing whether the frontier wars, quote, war, happened, or really if we could think of it as war. And I think we've moved past that. And we have to remember, of course, that word war is not a contemporary thing that's been applied to the past. War was the word that was often used at the time, right? But so we've moved forward in some respects, but we're still stuck, we're still debating where the emphasis lies, I mean, to what extent, for example, does the reality of that nationwide history of frontier warfare that goes from 1788 to 1930s, to what extent is that the story of the foundation of this country? We're still arguing over that. Look at the debate in the War Memorial, right, about whether to represent frontier history. So progress is slow, it's incremental. History is deeply political still, I think, but the points of ignition have just shifted. And in a way, I think, Tony Abbott's book, the irony is that it does have a political mission, of course. It's not surprising, I guess. Because I think that for conservatives, there's a question that goes something like this. How can we come up with a history that we can live with? How can we come up with a history that will allow the nation to exist peacefully and be comfortable with itself? We have to find that story somehow. So let's go and find it, right? Let's go and give the people one. That debate's still there.
But isn't that first question also what you're doing? I mean, aren't you also attempting a history we can live with? Yes.
my Australia's a different...
But it's different from theirs, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, true. No, that's true. Yeah, it's different from theirs. Yeah.
Sorry, I think there's one... No, we'll go to Ian next. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. Name's John Lamb. I've gone from being an architect to an historian more recently and closely tied with Frank. Well, a comment generally, though, I appreciate and the very importance of the Indigenous connection and that fit to the British thing. But yet I'm surprised to find there has not been a single mention of the multicultural background and of others of Asian nations, of the Chinese and the Japanese input. And just as a little contrast you might comment on, you commented on the 500 Aboriginals who died in northwestern Australia during that same early 20th century period. A similar number of Japanese died in the pearling industry, supporting, the most important industry of that area in that same period.
Yeah.
All covered in the book, John.
All in the book.
Great aplomb,
Sorry.
including the pearling industry.
I haven't had a chance to read it.
There's a beautiful picture. There's a beautiful picture
There's a picture of the pearling industry, And there's a chapter on, just so you're aware, there's a long chapter on migration as well, which brings in histories of Chinese, Australian, Japanese, Irish immigrants. It's all mixed up, but there's a long chapter on that in the book.
I think we've got a question over here. Yeah.
Hi.
We didn't cover it in the conversation, but it's there. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by what you said about the Anzac story, and where this question's coming from is that I heard that when Charles Bean was trying to write the history of the First World War, he actually started his book with a chapter about the influence of women and the impact they'd had and their contribution to the war. But the publishers at the time didn't like the approach. They wanted the Bronze Anzac legend, and the women got relegated to a footnote in chapter 11. I'm just wondering whether in this history you deal at all with the suppression of women's history in Australia. Not just in that, but in other aspects.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. No, look, I try to do that at various points throughout the book. I mean, the book is 60,000 words, and I did originally have an idea for a lot of the chapters are called, like Fire and Water or War and Memory, and I did have an idea for a chapter Men and Women as well. And I did, basically, push comes to shove, I've got 60,000 words, things had to go. I lost 20,000 words as it was from the original draft. But that's the nature of the beast. But it's there throughout. It's there in relation to the struggle for the vote, women getting the vote. It's also there in terms of domestic violence, which I linked through to the present day as well. And it's there in lots of different ways throughout. Yeah.
Mark, I wanted to ask you, to what extent did you have to deal with the fact that we now have a planet that is in a difficult, dangerous situation, which we've never known we've had before?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Yeah, look, that's a really good question. The question of climate change and the threat that we're all under, I guess in this chapter called Fire and Water, I try to show, for example, one of the threads about fire that I really am trying to bring through is that the fires we've experienced recently, you'll often hear people say, for example, the Black Summer fires, there's a long history of bushfire in Australia, it's just another repeat of what we've had before, right? One of the things I'm trying to do is to show that those fires that we've experienced recently are fundamentally different from the fires of the past, that these are the result of anthropogenic climate change, and that we are looking at a very, very different beast here. And it's a beast of our own creation and our impact on the planet. And that, in a way, so yes, I mean, I try to be... I bring that in at various points in the first chapters and also, but especially in that chapter. Yeah.
I think we've got time for one more question. It's Craig.
Thank you. Hey, Mark. Craig Cormick here.
Hi, Craig.
Hi. Quick question. Every couple of years we get a new condensed history of Australia. And we're lucky to have 2 out this year, looking from different points of view. How far off do you think we are until we get an Indigenous history of Australia, short history of Australia?
Well, as a black ink author, I can tell you, and Frank, 2 authors here, we know that Larissa Behrendt is currently writing the shortest Indigenous history of Australia, and that's not going to be too far away, and it's one that I'm looking forward very much to reading. So yeah, thanks for the question. It's on the way. It's on the way.
There you go, Luke. That'll be an event of the future, I hope. Yeah. Mark McKenna in conversation with Larissa Behrendt.
Well,
thank you.
And
the perfect segue, I think, and also looking forward to that one, not just because Larissa is also our chair as well, but continuing that theme and that really engaging theme of those short histories. Even if our questions did start out a little bit like a historian's confessional, it felt like at times there. I'm not a historian, but I really enjoyed the conversation. I've also really enjoyed the book, and particularly that concept, Mark, of the more voices, the more perspectives, and that broader stories, and how you find a pathway into those histories, I think is really interesting. Particularly for us at the library, obviously there's ways in there and connections, and there's so many things and references that are in the book there that relate directly to things that we have in our collections here, that I kept finding myself going, oh yeah, I know where that is, Okay. So please encourage everyone to do your own research, buy the book, read the book, follow up here at the library, either online or on site, with your own research here as well. Thank you so much to our audience for coming out tonight and for those questions. A huge thank you to Mark and Frank for the discussion tonight. We are going to continue the discussion upstairs, so Mark will be available to do some book signing as well. So we'll meet you all upstairs in the foyer after this, but please join me in thanking Mark and Frank for tonight's discussion.
Thank you.